But first, even though we knew it wouldn't be good, the state of the books in Victoria were worse than predicted. Fiscal disgrace, with net debt headed for $171.4 billion, with no Fed income plan to pay back borrowings outside what the Andrews government spent in a mad panic during COVID. Simon Love was there today and has all the details.
Borrowing a campaign slogan, the Andrews government is preparing to slash spending and tax big to stabilise soaring debt. $2.1 billion will be saved by axing between 3,000 and 4,000 public sector jobs within 12 months. The government has stabilised net debt, budgeting it at $135 billion this year to more than $171 billion by 2026. The state will remain in deficit for 3 years before posting modest surpluses by 2026. To pay back more than $31 billion spent during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's a 10-year COVID levy, an extra land tax charge of an average $1,300 on 860,000 properties, and extra payroll tax on businesses with a national payroll of more than $10 million a year. The budget spends big on health, almost $5 billion. There's $1 billion to revive the State Electricity Commission. The government will also abolish stamp duty on commercial and industrial properties from July 1 next year. The payroll tax-free threshold will be raised from $700,000 to $900,000. Business insurance duty will also be abolished. The government is also bringing forward the closure of the native timber harvesting industry by 6 years to next year.
Right, so what's it all mean for Victorians and the rest of the country that used to rely on the state to pay its own way? Joining me now, business commentator at the Herald Sun, Terry McCrann. Well, let's just start with a top line. Terry, how'd you score the budget?
Well, Peter, I would have said this was a budget designed to persuade the last Victorian leaving the state to please turn out the lights, except by the time that happens, by the time Dan Andrews gets through closing all the coal-fired power stations and recreating the SEC powered by wind and solar, there won't be any lights on in the state anyway. This was a dreadful budget to reflect a dreadful situation. I mean, give me a break, Peter. Dan Andrews is claiming that COVID made him do it. COVID made him create all this extra debt. That doesn't get you very far, because why did we get all this extra spending in COVID? Far more than the other states, because we had those 6 lockdowns. He's also claiming that Phil Lowe, the Reserve Bank governor, made him do it, buy out and borrow all that extra money. I think the most important thing to remember about these numbers, Peter, is that this is the best possible case. This is all built on optimistic assumptions about the state economy and about the federal economy going forward. I don't think we've got a hope in hell of actually getting to that surplus in 3 years' time.
I just might add too, on those COVID excuses he had, of that $171 billion of debt, only 31% of that was COVID spending.
Exactly.
So he doesn't tell you, he doesn't give us an excuse for the other quantum of money he's borrowing from overseas. But business hit hard, particularly today, with the taxes related to corporations and others. Business lobby in Victoria, unusually outspoken. Usually they're dolts. They don't say much down here against the government, but they were vocal today. Have a listen.
What we have seen, though, is a horror move to increase land taxes yet again and to reduce the threshold, which means that a lot more people in Victoria are going to be captured by land tax and see it increase and impact even further on them.
Business is being used as a cash cow, and business is bearing the burden for a lot of the costs that are being imposed on the Victorian community at the moment.
So I'm keen to know, Terry, if you're a multinational or national business even, why would you open up a head office in Victoria if you're going to be slugged with payroll tax? Wouldn't you just strip down your Victorian operations? You keep your shop fronts maybe, but you wouldn't put your head office in the state anymore, because you'll pay more in Victoria compared to any other state.
This is an anti-jobs move, Peter, a very direct anti-jobs move by, exactly as you say, don't employ people in Victoria because you're going to be hit by this extra land tax, this extra payroll tax, and then you've also got the extra land taxes impacting on property investors and just Victorians with a second home, a holiday house. This is very much a budget which encourages people to leave the state, encourages businesses to leave the state. That extra property tax, that extra payroll tax will kick in at relatively low levels of employment. You're talking about 10 million a year, that's the national payroll, which is any business that's employing more than about 100 people. So that you're not talking about excluding really medium-sized businesses from it. And these levies are currently structured to go for 10 years. Now, again, we get to 2033, 34. I don't see how you can actually expect that these levies will end. This is very much a long-term budget of pain.
And your point there about second homes, investment properties, that sort of thing there, the land values, the land taxes have gone out there and they're increasing. The numbers, I'm told, if your property or your land value, not the actual dwelling, but your land value is $500,000, you'll cop an extra $1,100 per annum. Land tax in the States already hurting. This will force people to sell up their investment property. That then impacts rental stock, and you have this sort of cyclical impact of these sorts of moves. What about this removal of the payroll exemption tax on the top 15% of non-government schools? That looks ideological to me.
Well, it's not ideological. It's going to hurt, and it's going to lead to increased fees. You might say, OK, it's only the rich end of town that will have to pay these increased fees, but all of these measures are feeding through into higher charges across the board, not just by government, but by business, having to recoup the extra taxes they're paying, or employers more generally having to recoup the extra taxes they pay. This is a budget which will damage employment prospects for Victorians going forward, and the reduction in the public sector is pitiful. In contrast, the 3,000 to 4,000 a year is just a minuscule number of the huge increase in public sector employment if it is delivered.
They go heavy on consultants when they take away the headcount. You and I know how that works. Let's have a listen to Union Chief Michael O'Connor. This is from the CFMEU. He's part of the Forestry Division. There were some changes today about forestry in Victoria. He was pretty angry. Have a listen.
Last time I looked, all knowledge and wisdom resides in Spring Street, and particularly when it comes to an industry that's based in regional Victoria, consulting people in regional Victoria and the people who work in the industry and the people who rely on the industry is pretty important. It's a shame that he only governs for Melbourne, Geelong, Ballarat and Bendigo.
So he says there that Union was not consulted. Now, what's interesting here, this means the end of the forestry industry in Victoria. We need forestry for homes. We'll have to import our forest timbers from overseas. They don't have the same environmental standards we do. But remember last week, we just opened up the forestry deal with China, yet we're not going to grow timbers which are renewable in Victoria. It doesn't make sense.
The head explodes when you see this sort of thing because it's so petty and pointless, but it is so destructive in terms of the impact it will have on jobs in Victoria, in regional Victoria, and obviously businesses. And again, it's an invitation for both people and businesses to leave the state. If you actually close down an industry, what do you expect people to do? Do you expect them to stay here and take up basket weaving or something? I mean, it's just absurd and really captures the pettiness as well as the brutality of the Andrews government.